Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. We are moderatorless today. So Earl and I are going to be having a little back and forth session. Hopefully that's to everyone's enjoyment. Today's series is on vulnerability management with Oxium and SecPod and, how that relates to it being practical for deployment and for usage within your environments. Before we kick it off, I want to thank everybody for joining and also want to turn it over to Earl so he can introduce himself, though I imagine our audience has a good understanding of who you are. So we'll go ahead and
Yeah.
let you introduce
No,
yourself, Earl.
this is always fun to talk about, vulnerability management, and it's always good to join you, Marcus. Marcus and I, we just met maybe a year ago, probably a little less than a year ago, and we're I feel like we've somehow become kindred spirits in what we're doing because we might think vulnerability management is like really cool to talk about, but a lot of people think we're weird. And just in terms of people showing up, if you see my background here, this is because as Marcus said, we're a little bit our pre-production meeting was a little bit sporadic here because we didn't have some pieces that we thought we were going to have here. So you get to look at my office here without a filter behind it. But anyways, that won't affect the quality of the content that we're going to talk about, because what we really want to talk about, is the practical aspects of vulnerability management. There's a lot of talks out there about the importance of vulnerability management and why you should be doing vulnerability management. But we want to go a couple layers beneath that strategic discussion and say, like, how do you actually do vulnerability management? Like, what does it mean? And we just think that it's time to have the conversation not with the CEOs and not with the CIOs, but let's go to the security analysts and actually have a conversation with them and say, like, all right, look, you're entering into the world of vulnerability management. What does it mean? How do you get started? How do you get going? And so hopefully this is the first of several conversations that Marcus and I will have around practical vulnerability management. And so we want to touch on a few things today, and then maybe we'll deep dive into some of these topics in future sessions here. But let's just jump right in. And if we go all the way back to the beginning, you're a company, and I see a lot of these companies. You walk in there and it's like, hey, what are you doing for vulnerability management? And typically what people think of is, hey, I'm doing patch management. I'm rolling out my Microsoft updates. And that's a form of vulnerability management, in the sense that Microsoft gives you the updates, and hopefully you're pushing those out relatively quickly. But that's not the whole story. So, like, from your perspective, what do you think is, when you say vulnerability management, like, what do you think is the scope of that statement?
Man, I think it depends on your viewpoint, right? You and I have our viewpoints from our lenses, but I think it depends on whether you're a large organization, an SMB, or a smaller organization. What that you just touched on it. Is it just grabbing your patches? Is it just rolling out some Microsoft updates, or accepting an update to Zoom or whatever you're using? I think looking at it from the lens of what resources do you have for that, and how are you doing it? For my wife, she doesn't understand what vulnerability management is, and she doesn't care. She says, that's what I have you for. And I think that's also a lot of companies' viewpoints of, that's what I have the cybersecurity team for, or that's what I pay these other companies to do for me. And if they don't do them, I don't know the difference. So I think it depends on the lens. From our perspective in the cybersecurity world, it's really understanding what is out there that's going to affect me negatively. What does my footprint look like? What does my attack surface look like? What are all of the different points of entry that I want to minimize access to? That's vulnerability management to me. But as we go through the different sizes of the organizations, I think you get down to a smaller size business, and vulnerability management to them is the basics, the absolute basics. What do I have to have? I got pushed in Microsoft update. I guess I'll have to restart my computer. And then you get up to the enterprise, where you have these cybersecurity teams pushing out the vulnerabilities and saying, hey, we need to go do these. And then you have patch tools to push them out. So I think with all the different organizations you and I have worked with, or I think it depends on what slice of the pie and how big that pie is to each organization. What do you think? I mean,
Yeah,
is
because
that
I always walk in and I say, hey, what are you doing for vulnerability management? And they'll come back and say we're doing the Microsoft patches, and I always say like, well, what about everything else? And the part of the issue is nobody knows what the everything else is. And
there you go.
if you look at like the CIS 18, step number one of the CIS 18 is understand where all your assets are at, right? Which nobody does. Nobody really understands where all their assets are at. But even a bigger question than that is, do they even know what their assets are? So not everything in your organization is a Windows desktop or a Windows laptop. You have switches maybe, and you have routers, or you have firewalls, and you have multi-function devices. Anything with an IP address is something that you need to manage the vulnerabilities on. And when you start having these conversations with people, it's like, oh, I didn't really realize that I had to take care of anything other than my Windows devices. So that's kind of where you start from. You really have to start from what is in my organization. So if you're a new security analyst and you're just taking over a role because your company has figured out like, hey, we got to start taking this security stuff more seriously. One of the first things you really have to get through, beyond, your firewall and your endpoint protection, vulnerability management is like right there. I consider it one of the four pillars that you have to have for a good security program is a good vulnerability management program. And so if you're starting out with a clean sheet of paper, it should be, what devices do I actually have in this organization? Because all of those operating systems or whatever that drive those devices, that's what you need to manage. And so then the next question is, well, how do I know what vulnerabilities I have to fix? Which then gets you into your next big purchase, because ultimately you're not going to know that, because there's no way you can just get a bunch of email bulletins from Cisco and from Adobe and organize all of these email notifications. What you really need is a internal vulnerability management tool. So a scanner, something like that. Now, I'm trying not to be like, I'm trying to be a little agnostic here, even though SecPod is a sponsor of this program. So, I will say like something like SanerNow from SecPod is a tool that helps you scan your network, helps you discover all your devices, and most importantly, it'll tell you all the vulnerabilities that are present on those devices, because you're never going to be able to manage that without a tool. So thing number one, or probably thing number two, as you're entering vulnerability management, is you got to pick a tool, and that is the important piece of the discovery that has to happen so that you can then start to do the rest of the process. So, and we were talking earlier before this show started about, the funnel idea. Well, the thing that feeds into the top of the funnel is your scanner. Without the scanner, you have nothing going into the top of your funnel to get you down to what it is that you have to fix.
So let's talk about that for a second, because my previous roles, right, and I'm sure in yours as well, you walk into a customer site and you get the scanners in place, you get your vulnerability scanner, you get the results back, right? You get that data back. Now, I have seen people literally freak out at the results, millions of vulnerabilities, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, thousands of vulnerabilities, and then people just don't know where to start, right? They lose their business. They don't understand, why do I have all of this? How did this possibly happen? What does this mean? The list of questions goes on and on. Where do you guide somebody who's just seeing that for the first time? Their eyes get really big, and then they've had that moment of realization. What do you
But
tell
yeah,
them?
it's like you're hiking. It's like you're hiking, right? And you're like, hey, I want to get down to the river, and you're hiking the Grand Canyon, and you come to the edge and you look out and you just see this huge canyon in front of you, and you're like, nope, not going down there. You turn around, you walk back to your car. That's that's what I think a lot of people do when they run that first scan, versus saying like, all right, well, if I got to get from here down to that river, obviously I got to just start working my way down this trail and head through this canyon. So I can't even tell you how many times that I've gone into an organization, whether I've worked there or consulted there or whatever, and you find one of two situations. One is there's just nothing, and they have absolutely no um, concept of how many vulnerabilities they have, because they don't have a scanner and they don't really have a program. So you have that. The second most common thing that I see is, they took the step to get a scanner. They ran their first scan and they found, like you said, thousands of vulnerabilities. And they're like, I don't even know how to compute this. And so they just really never did anything with it. And so they have a tool. They can check the box on an insurance policy application, but they're not really doing the management piece of it. They're doing the discovery piece, but not the management. And so then comes the really hard work of prioritization. So you do the discovery, but then you have to do the prioritization. And so when you start doing the prioritization and you have these thousands of vulnerabilities that you're staring at, there's a couple different ways to slice this, and you got to pick one. It's literally up to the vulnerability management analyst or coordinator or whatever to pick. You got to pick a poison. So you can either say, I'm going to go after all the critical alerts, and that's all I'm going to focus on. And so you say, out of those thousands of vulnerabilities, maybe you have 100 critical vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. And then you just got to start working on that. A different way of looking at it is you look at all the assets that are being discovered and you say, well, here I have a bunch of end of life devices. And so then you can go down the path of saying, hey, I'm going to drive all of the end of life devices out of my network, because there's invariably going to be a ton of vulnerabilities setting on those devices. They're not all critical. You're going to have a bunch of mediums and highs and lows and everything in there. But that effort is a different effort.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, part of the problem of dealing with vulnerabilities is you just can't do it all. You can't do it all at once. And so that's why you really have to pick a path and then just drive that to fruition. Because if you try to bounce among different piles of vulnerabilities, you're never going to get anything done. So you do have to, knowledge is power in some sense, but it's also, now all of a sudden of all this risk, and it's going to gnaw at you until you kind of sort that out. But you just got to pick a path.
So you're saying get into that analysis paralysis too much if you start to look at everything.
Well, yeah, because just think about how people just work in general. I mean, they start a project, and in the beginning there's a lot of momentum behind it, but then you constantly are going to run into like that slow slog that is in the middle of a project. And when you hit that minor resistance, you're kind of like, this is getting kind of hard, let me jump over to this other thing. And then you make a little bit of progress on this other thing, and then the same thing happens, and then you jump to another thing. And then at the end of the month, you're looking at your next scan and you're saying, well, I really didn't accomplish much of anything, because not everything is a quick hit. There are a few things where it's just like, hey, push the patches, clean this stuff up. And
Right.
which is another approach you can take too, is you just say, like, where are all the quick hitters? And you just can clean out a massive amount of vulnerabilities just doing the quick hitters. But eventually that runs out, and then you got to kind of go into the things that are going to take a little bit more effort. And a lot of these things do take effort, because if you say, hey, this server operating system needs an upgrade, well, then you look at it and say, well, I can't upgrade the operating system on that server because it's running these 3 applications, and these 3 applications won't run on the next version of the operating system because the software vendor hasn't released their update yet.
Okay.
And so, this is the constant frustration that comes into it, because you have a security analyst trying to work with a infrastructure team, which then has to support an application team,
Right.
and trying to line all of that up, it takes a lot of coordination, and it takes a lot of, it takes a little bit of charisma and a little bit of, politicking to get this stuff done. But, you know, that's why I always say, if you're going into the security field, you got to have two things, which is curiosity and persistence, because the persistence is the part that gets you through working with an infrastructure team, working with an application team, trying to drive organizational change that, the organization may not be that interested in, because they don't understand the risk the way that you understand the risk.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And I think if we go back to the practical aspect of it, right? One of the things you mentioned was identifying like maybe some EOL systems, end of life systems. That, do I really need to worry about those, or is there going to be minimal anyway? I think one of the things I like to do is sort as well. I mean, maybe not to the extent that you and I have had to do it with risk matrices and having to sit there with a spreadsheet and identify my critical systems and what the risk and impact is going to look like, but maybe to the extent of I can sort through and sift through systems saying, hey, these have really high vulnerabilities, but I don't have to worry about it because they're only leveraged from the inside. So somebody would have to be inside my network. Maybe I can push those off to another time in a patch cycle, just trying to practically sift through the larger aspects of it. Like you said, right? Hit your low hanging fruit. And then it kind of like paint stripes, right? You're just going to paint the next section, hit your low hanging fruit, then hit your systems of high importance. And then your applications of high importance, working your way up from a practical perspective, right? I don't know if that makes sense from what you've seen
Yeah,
with your.
and I think the thing that you really got to get comfortable with when you're doing this vulnerability management stuff is, when you run that first scan and you see 10,000 vulnerabilities sitting out there, you got to realize you're never going to get that number to zero. I know a lot of people, especially like management, it's like, hey, we paid for this tool. How come we're not getting down to zero on these vulnerabilities? Like, you'll never, ever get to zero. It's a practical impossibility unless you're running a really small network with like 10 devices on it. And then, maybe in that case, you probably should get to zero. But if you have, even over 100 devices on your network, along with your networking gear and all that other stuff, you really got to get comfortable with the fact that that number is never going to get to a happy number. Because as soon as you fix some stuff, then some new things are coming in the following month, and then there's always going to be something there. So just get comfortable with that. Now, to your point of then saying, there's low hanging fruit, there's maybe the internal systems that aren't affected. That's another approach to take, is you look at some of these common databases, like CISA has a database, and VulnSec has a database, where you can look out there and say what vulnerabilities are actively exploited, because that's another way of prioritizing these vulnerabilities. Because if there's a vulnerability with no exploit, you can probably live with that a little bit longer. But as soon as there's an exploit, you got to get that vulnerability sorted out, because if you have anything, whether it's externally facing or not, if there's an exploit available for it, you got to get that thing taken care of. Because even if you have an internal system that isn't accessible from the internet, it's still accessible to a user. And the adversary will quickly figure out a way to get that exploit into your environment. If they can't hit it from the outside, they'll figure out a way to get it inside, whether that's through a phishing email or some other type of social engineering attack. So I would say, if you look at different ways to prioritize these vulnerabilities, you look at the critical ones, and then you look at the critical ones with an exploit. Those probably go into your red hot bucket. So you can kind of look at it as a risk matrix, like you were alluding to, where you can say critical and exploitable, critical and not exploitable, high and exploitable, and kind of put these things in the bucket. But but typically you're not even really taking that scientific of an approach to it. If you're the lone person doing vulnerability management, you're just looking at your reports, and you're not doing the scientific analysis of gridding all this stuff out. You're just saying, what do I got to focus on with my limited resources, because I have maybe 2 hours a month that I can spend on trying to resolve this stuff.
Right.
And so I would say the first thing you go for is the critical vulnerabilities. You figure out, typically your tool will tell you if it's exploitable or not. There would be some indicator that this critical vulnerability has an exploit. If not, then you can quickly go out to websites like CISA, like I mentioned, is a good one, where you can say, are there exploits for these critical vulnerabilities? And then, work on that. Or you can just say, hey, it's a critical vulnerability. I'm going to do what I can do to get it out of here regardless. But usually if there's an exploit, you can get other people to cooperate with you quicker, meaning the infrastructure team, the application teams, they will tend to cooperate with you quicker if you say, hey, look, man, there's this vulnerability and there's an active exploit out there, and there's a criminal organization that is observed using this exploit. And so you get all of those things lined up. That's called motivation. And you can typically motivate your coworkers to help you out in that situation.
So you've mentioned it a few times. Would you say then communication would be the next pillar? We've talked about understanding what's there, getting your arms around the environment. We've talked about understanding the vulnerabilities for that environment. Would you say that communication is that next pillar?
Yeah, I would say it is. You have discovery, you have prioritization, and then you have communication. Because, once you understand what needs to get fixed, now you are trying to basically sell that to the rest of the organization. Because very rarely, and it shouldn't even be set up this way, very rarely the vulnerability management person is the one that's actually pushing out all the fixes to this. And if you're set up that way, that's not a great situation to be in, because you don't want to be the person in isolation that's just saying, hey, I saw something needed to be fixed, so I pushed out a patch, and then it brings the network down. Like you want to be, collaborating with people, if for no other reason than, it gives you a sanity check on, like, yeah, you can't do that because, we have end of month reporting coming up, or, we have a big presentation that we're giving to clients who are coming on site, and we can't risk, having a network outage or something. So you really want to just be the person that says, here's all the risk, and then have these conversations with the people that are actually going to implement those changes, so that you have, different viewpoints and different perspectives on it, but still with the idea that it's got to get done. But instead of doing it at 10 in the morning, maybe you do it at, 10 at night when there's no one in the office or something like that. So you got to, kind of have that reality check. But definitely it's about communication.
Awesome. So I want to touch back on the point of understanding what's in your environment. There's a controversy in our space today about whether or not the cloud applications and anything that you put up in the cloud is part of your responsibility for that infrastructure. Is it going to affect you? Do I have to worry about it from a vulnerability standpoint? So I see a half smile starting to form on you, Earl. I know I have my viewpoint, but I definitely want to get it out there for the audience from what you think, and whether or not that's something we should be concentrating on as part of that vast group of things that we need to have under our umbrella, know the vulnerabilities for, or whether or not it's not a risk and we can just shove that off to the vendor that sold it to us.
Yeah, it's
controversial topic.
It's a little bit complicated. It's a little bit complicated because you have these two environments. So you have your localized environment, whether it's your office, your co-location space, your the tangible things that you have that environment, and then you have this cloud or outside of you environment to take care of. And typically, in the olden days, vulnerability management was vulnerability management. But now it's actually turning into vulnerability and configuration management, because, we're finding out that, a lot of badness is happening not just because the software is flawed. It's also happening because the software wasn't fully implemented, or it was implemented incorrectly, or we just didn't finish all the steps. And so there are these configuration issues that are still hanging out there. That's usually what you find out in the cloud, is that, when you spin up a new S3 bucket or whatever, you can't just take the AWS default configurations and say, yep, we're all good, we got this thing spun up there, let's throw a bunch of data in there. You need to actually do some more steps to that, and that's where that shared responsibility model really comes into play, that people don't really fully take into account. Is when you look at those default settings, there's a lot of gaps there from a security perspective.
Right.
And so I agree with you that it needs to be part of the whole risk management process. And we do need to broaden our perspectives of what vulnerability management is, so that it includes configurations. And again, SecPod does bring up, like, hey, here's some misconfigurations, because that does need to be part of that discussion. So when you go to the cloud, you have to have tool sets that help you understand not just the vulnerabilities that might be there, because typically the underlying vulnerabilities are going to get handled by the cloud provider, but the configurations aren't going to be. And so you're going to have some sort of a cloud posture management tool or something that points out, like, hey, here's where you have a cloud workload that has publicly available shares, or you have passwords that are still setting at default password settings or whatever. So you do have to factor that in there. So I know if you're like new to this, we're probably overwhelming you with stuff, but it's a journey, just like everything else in security is. You got to understand what the landscape looks like so that you can start to navigate it, but you can't get from the top of the canyon to the bottom of the canyon safely unless you do it meticulously. I mean, there's a quick way to get to the bottom of the canyon, but you probably don't want to take that route. You got to work through it slowly, meticulously, bring some people with you, so that it's kind of like the Hobbit going on his journey. You gotta bring a band with you so that you can accomplish different things in different situations.
I love it. I love that analogy. I hadn't heard that one before, so I really like that. Going on the quest.
Well,
So
I'm full of stuff.
I
That's
love
like
it.
my one redeeming value, is I can put analogies together.
That's great. So we've talked about figuring it out, finding the vulnerabilities, the communication aspect. What's next? What's the next pillar? I know what it is from my point of view, but I want to get the expertise on the ground with what you and Oxygen have been doing for your clients. Oh, what's the next pillar that you go in there and say, here's what you got to do next?
Yeah, once you communicating to, like, the different people that have to do different parts of that process is one thing, but this is again where the persistence comes into play, because people are busy, people doing lots of other things, and your priorities aren't their priorities. And so you do have to follow up on that and say, all right, the patches are going to go out this Thursday. So on Wednesday, I'm typically saying, hey, are the patches all ready to go out on Thursday? And then on Thursday, I'm like, hey, did the patches go out today? So you do got to kind of you become basically the project manager for vulnerability remediations. Whether or not that's your official title or not, it's really kind of the vulnerability management person's job to make sure that happens. And then once that Thursday patch happened, then I like to do scans monthly. I know there's some people that say do it quarterly, and there's some people out there that are actually doing it annually, which is just insane to me. But I don't even think quarterly is good. To me, monthly scans or monthly reviews are like the minimum. And things like good tools are continuously monitoring. So anytime I want, I can jump in there and see like what's going on. So I can see if those patches were applied, an hour ago, because, I'll start to see that vulnerability count change. But so it's really that be persistent, follow up on it, and then verify it. It's the old Ronald Reagan thing of, you trust that people are going to do things, but you're constantly verifying like that they're doing it, that they did it. And then, then you always learn from that. So whatever bumps came up in the process, you take notes of that, you do your after action thinking about it. It doesn't have to be a formal process. You just say like, hey, what worked this time? What didn't work this time? And then in the next monthly cycle, you just, start to fix things. And, maybe it's the way you communicate to people. Maybe some people like a meeting where you're discussing it one-to-one. Some people might just want an email and just say, hey, look, just tell me what I got to do, and I'll put it in my priority list and get it done. So you got to learn the best ways to interact with this, band that you're going on the journey with, and just constantly be evaluating that. But, I always, it's the proof is always in the data, so like you do your scans and you should be able to see like, oh, I see that vulnerability is gone, and you'll see a bunch of new vulnerabilities coming in there. But, that's the constant battle that we're fighting.
So for our viewers and our audience out there, from the practical standpoint, we're saying, first of all, from a practical perspective, figure out what you have, right? Because nobody just grabs one of these. Let me plug this in real quick and do some testing, right? And then you got something new on the network that, some developer said, oh, I just got to do something, right? Another point of entry for somebody who's a bad actor out there. But understanding what you have from a practical standpoint, it doesn't mean it has to be perfect. Second part we're talking about was the vulnerability. Don't freak out when you see large numbers. Do your swipes of your low-hanging fruit categorization of systems that maybe are going to be end of life that you don't need to worry about right away. Maybe some other systems that may or may not have some other things in place, whether they're mitigating controls, compensating controls, or there isn't an exploit. And then communication. So you're going to have to be the practical, what would you call it? Spokesperson, advocate, a little bit of everything for that.
Yeah, you're basically the vulnerability management manager.
Salesperson.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. People in security never consider themselves salespeople, and they're like, I never want to be a salesperson. But unfortunately, that's what people in security is salespeople, because we got to educate ourselves on what the risk is, and then we got to go sell that risk to the rest of the organization so that they will, cooperate with us in solving the problem. And so yeah, you do got to work out your interpersonal skills. So if you're an introvert, that's cool. I'm an introvert too, as you can tell. I'm a very, inward person, but you got to work through that and figure out like, how do I start to influence others and, take this risk, understand it myself, so that I can then teach other people, that that's important. So, to your kind of downward funnel here, at the top, it's like, understand what you got, get a tool, do your scan, don't freak out, prioritize, communicate, and follow up, and then rinse and repeat. And this is what you need to do on a monthly cycle. If you're on something other than a monthly cycle, I really think you should consider, changing that and getting, if you're on an annual cycle, you definitely got to change that. I mean, the landscape changes too quickly for annual vulnerability scans. Quarterly vulnerability scans, I think, might have worked, 10 years ago, but they definitely don't work today. I mean, the time to exploit between when, say, Microsoft releases their patches on a Tuesday, there's already code, in place within 2 hours I've seen a couple studies where within 2 hours of Microsoft releasing their patch, there's already exploit code, released in the wild. Maybe it's just some researchers, doing some testing or whatever, but that exploit code is already developed 2 hours later. So you can't wait a quarter to do your vulnerability management. It just doesn't work anymore. So
Yeah. Well, and would you say it's even faster now with our AI tool friends, right? Put some information in there and let it crunch for you
well,
and give you us.
the interesting thing is, we always have this concept of a 0-day, which is a vulnerability or an exploit for a vulnerability that hasn't been publicly released yet. And so those are like rare, and now there's like this whole black market for governments that want to buy these 0 days that researchers discover. But they're talking about with AI that the concept of 0 days won't be this like weird anomaly anymore. It will be like the norm. Like AI will be able to figure out flaws in software before any of these vendors are releasing their updates on that. And so once it gets commoditized through AI and it's no longer like this really niche market that it is right now, $1 million exploit that, say Saudi Arabia or some country is paying for today, with AI, they don't have to pay $1 million for it anymore. And so you're just going to see an explosion in 0 days being weaponized just because of AI making it so affordable for any threat organization to acquire that ability to, find them and then exploit them.
Yeah, I think it's important that we also call out, we're not trying to be fear mongers, right? These are just natural potential outcomes and real
Yeah,
world things that are going on.
But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this is the thought process you have to go through when you're saying, do I want an annual vulnerability management? Do I want a quarterly vulnerability management scan? Do I want monthly scans, or do I want to continuously scan? Because you have to account for the threat landscape as you're doing vulnerability management, because that's the whole point. The whole point of vulnerability management is to figure out how to keep yourself safe in an evolving threat landscape. So you have to understand the threat landscape in order to have an effective vulnerability management program.
Yeah, one of the things I chat with a few folks about recently was when you're going into an organization and you're talking to them about getting their arms around what they truly have. I've heard this multiple times. Well, here's what we know we have, but we don't know what's over in this department. I'm going to leave names out so that we don't accuse anybody of anything, but we don't know what's in this department because they have their own IT group and they have their own systems. So then you end up with the siloed component with shadow IT, with these systems that are running under the radar of the general vulnerability compliance, maintenance, patching, IT update routines. And how do you go about addressing, the
Yeah, I mean, that's a leadership issue, because somewhere at the top of that organization is somebody that's responsible for that entire network, regardless of what the silos are underneath that. And you got to pull vulnerability management up to the top of that organization. It can't really effectively manage risk if it's only looking at certain pieces of that network, because you're never going to be insulated from the rest of the risk on that network. And so, I would say if you have shadow IT and if you have these different silos of, networking going on, you really got to bust through that, because, very rarely, unless you're in like a DoD situation or maybe a PCI situation where you have the card holder data environment, or you have the CUI environment where you want to keep things separated because you have to. Even in those cases, you can still scan all the way around that stuff, and you really should be scanning in there as well. And so I really don't see a good reason why you would isolate off anything from a vulnerability management perspective, because you would still want to understand the risk in those areas. And
So
that's
if
a
we're to
leadership issue.
put a quote around this, would it be no one is above the vulnerability scan?
That's right.
To put a corny quote on it. Yeah, so I think that's great information, Earl. I agree with you 100%, right? Leadership is key, and where you put that security component, you can't just keep shoving it lower under IT, and you can't keep shoving it in a corner. If it's not elevated to the point where it's encompassing the company, you've really only, closed your front door, left your back door open, and your side gates unlocked, and put a sign up saying, "Hey, nobody's home. Come on over." Um, I think that's a great way to look
So
at it.
I think just as we kind of wrap this up here, because we're going to try to keep these a little bit shorter, just because I've noticed over time, as I've done many of these podcasts, and you have too, that people track with you pretty well for about 30 minutes, and
Yep.
then I think just information overload and just attention fatigue kind of sets in. So like, we're going to wrap this up right now, and then we're going to come back. So this is the first of several conversations that Marcus and I are going to have around more practical aspects of vulnerability management and different components of risk management in general. But we definitely thank you for tuning in today and paying attention to what we have to say. And hopefully you liked what you saw, and I will definitely guarantee you that the next time we have a conversation, the production value is going to be much better on this. And hopefully that leads to a better viewing situation. But thanks again, and look forward to us probably in a few months coming out with another episode. Again, it'll be practical. There's enough like thought leadership going on out there at a strategic level. What we really want to do is get to the practitioners and help them understand how to do things better, smarter, faster, and commiserate with them a little bit, because whatever frustration you're feeling, I've already felt it many times, and Marcus has felt it too. And so we want to kind of help you work through some of the landmines that are out there and avoid some of the mistakes that we've made. So so just stay tuned and follow along here, and we'll help you out. Marcus, you got any last words?
No, those were fantastic last words, Earl. Again, today's raw and unfiltered, so the production value will be higher as we go through these series. One other thing, I want to thank Earl and Oxium for being part of these series, and also anybody who is looking for the rest of this. It is being recorded. It will be available on brighttalk.com. And the two companies again here are Oxium and SecPod. If anybody has any questions, please reach out to our respective websites. Thanks everybody for joining. Look forward to seeing you in the next series. Thanks, Earl. We appreciate you being here and being on with us.
All right, thanks.
Thanks,
See you
buddy.
next time.